The great hall of the Galactic Assembly floated in the cold dark of space, built around a dead star that had not burned in a million years. They called the station Orion's Cradle, and it was the largest structure ever built by living hands. Inside its walls, 438 species gathered to argue, to trade, to make laws, and to pretend they were equals. They were not equals. Everyone knew this. The Yori conclave sat at the top of the hall on platforms made of light, looking down on everyone else the way a mountain looks down on stones. They were the oldest species in the galaxy. They had been flying between stars when most other races were still learning to make fire, and they never let anyone forget it. At the very bottom of the hall, on the smallest platform, in the worst position, sat the humans. Ambassador HFY stood on that small platform with her hands folded behind her back. She was 53 years old, with gray running through her dark hair and lines on her face that had not been there 5 years ago. She had served as humanity's voice on the council for 11 years. 11 years of being ignored. 11 years of raising her hand and being told to wait. 11 years of smiling politely while ancient species treated her people like children who had wandered into a room full of adults. Today she was not smiling. The session had been called to discuss a new resolution. Counselor Dren of the Valkyrie hegemony had proposed something he called the doctrine of guided civilizations. The name sounded gentle. The words inside it were not. The doctrine would strip all junior species of independent military power. It would limit their territory to no more than 2 star systems. It would ban them from developing advanced artificial intelligence, and by some remarkable coincidence, the only species in the entire galaxy that qualified as a junior species under the doctrine's carefully written rules was humanity. Dren stood on his platform high above, reading the resolution in his deep, rumbling voice. He was tall and broad, with skin like polished stone and 4 arms that he used to gesture dramatically as he spoke. He talked about safety. He talked about stability. He talked about the dangers of allowing young and aggressive civilizations to grow too fast. He never once said the word human. He did not need to. Everyone in the hall knew exactly who he was talking about. Aura pressed the button on her podium to request the floor. A small light appeared indicating her request. High Speaker Yalthari of the Authority Conclave, who controlled the proceedings from the highest platform of all, looked down at the light. He was impossibly old, his body thin and stretched, his skin nearly transparent, his eyes glowing with a faint blue light that his species developed after their first 1,000 years of life. He ignored her request. Dren continued speaking. Aura pressed the button again. Yari looked at it again. He turned away. She pressed it a 3rd time. This time the high speaker did not even bother to look. In the observation gallery above the hall, a young Visari named Siovin sat with a recording device in his lap. He was a historian assigned to document the proceedings of the council for the Great Archive. He had been doing this job for 2 years, and in that time he had learned that council sessions were mostly boring. Old species talked, young species listened. Nothing changed, but today felt different. He could feel it in the air, the way one could feel a storm before it arrived. He watched the human ambassador standing on her tiny platform, pressing her button over and over, and he felt something cold move Through his chest, all stopped pressing the button. She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a small data tablet. She tapped it twice and then she spoke. Her voice rang out across the entire hall, cutting through Dren's speech like a blade. She had invoked Procedural Clause 7, Section 14 of the Council Charter. It was an obscure rule that guaranteed any member species the right to speak before any vote that directly affected their sovereignty. The rule had been written into the Charter 60 years ago when humanity first joined the Council. A young human legal team had insisted on it. The authority had agreed because they never imagined it would matter. No one else had ever read it. The hall fell silent. Yelly stared down at Ara with those ancient glowing eyes. For a long moment he said nothing. Then slowly he raised one thin hand and gestured for her to speak. Ara did not shout. She did not pound her fist on the podium. She did not cry or beg or threaten. She simply spoke in a clear, steady voice that carried to every corner of that enormous hall. She started with numbers. 60 years ago, the Rethvani plague had swept across 4 species and killed billions. Human doctors had worked for 3 years without sleep, without pay, without recognition. And they had found a cure. 11 billion lives saved. She gave the exact number. She named the worlds. 40 years ago, interstellar travel was slow and dangerous. Ships were lost every month to navigation errors. Human engineers had designed and built the Fold Space Navigation Grid, a system of beacons and calculations that cut travel time by 40% and made the shipping lane safe. Every species in the hall used it every single day. 30 years ago, the Dravasi and the Chelarn had been ready to destroy each other. Their war would have killed trillions and destabilized an entire sector of the galaxy. Human diplomats had walked into the middle of that war, unarmed, and had talked both sides into peace. Not the Council, not the authority. Humans 20 years ago, 3 worlds had been starving. Their crops had failed. Their food supplies were gone and their people were dying. Human scientists had shared food synthesis technology freely, without patents, without payment, without conditions. Those worlds were now feeding themselves and others. And the universal translation matrix, the system that allowed every species in the galaxy to understand every other species, the system that made the Council itself possible, that was human built, human maintained, human given as a gift. The day they joined, Alara listed all of this calmly, precisely, the way a teacher might read a list of facts to a classroom. She did not add emotion. She did not add commentary. She simply laid the truth on the floor of the hall and let it sit there. Then she stopped. She looked up at the platforms above her, at the hundreds of species who had sat in comfort while her people worked and gave and asked for nothing. She looked at Dren, who had written a doctrine to cave them. She looked at Yalari, who had refused to let her speak. And then she said the words that would echo across the galaxy for generations. You don't fear what we've done, you fear what we could become. The hall was silent, completely, absolutely silent. 437 species held their breath. All reached into her coat one more time. She pulled out a small crystalline chip, no bigger than her thumb. It caught the light and sparkled like a tiny star. She placed it on the podium with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than anything else that had been said that day. This is humanity's formal and irrevocable withdrawal from the Galactic Council. She said, effective. Immediately she stepped back from the podium. She turned, she walked toward the exit. And behind her, on every platform where a human delegate sat, every single one of them stood up and followed. They moved in silence, in perfect order, without hurry and without hesitation. Aides, translators, legal advisors, scientists, diplomats, every human in the hall left. The chaos that erupted behind them was unlike anything the Council had ever seen. Species that had not raised their voices in centuries were shouting. Platforms swayed as delegates surged forward. Yelthari called for order. His voice, which had commanded respect for 10,000 years, was swallowed by the noise. Dren stood frozen on his platform, his four hands hanging at his sides, his mouth slightly open. He had expected resistance. He had expected anger, bargaining, pleading. He had not expected this. He had not imagined, even for a moment, that the humans would simply leave. In the observation gallery, Kelvin gripped his recording device with trembling hands. He had recorded everything, every word, every moment, every second of silence. He watched the human delegates walk out of the hall in their perfect, quiet line. And he felt something he had never felt before. It took him a moment to identify it. It was fear, not fear of the humans. Fear of what would happen without them. He left the gallery and ran to the observation deck on the outer ring of the station. He arrived just in time to see the human ships departing. There were not many of them, a dozen frigates, a few transport vessels, one old research cruiser. They moved away from Orion's cradle in a single formation, smooth and precise like birds flying south before winter. The ships grew smaller against the black of space. Dead star behind them gave no light. Station's own glow reflected off their hulls until they were nothing but tiny points of brightness, and then they were gone. Kelvin stood at the window for a long time after they disappeared. Behind him, he could still hear the distant sound of the hall in chaos, voices shouting in 100 languages, the translation matrix struggling to keep up. He pressed his face closer to the cold glass and stared at the empty space where the human ships had been. What have we done? He whispered. No one answered. The stars did not care, and the humans were already gone. 6 months passed, and the galaxy told itself a story. The story went like this. The humans were young, they were emotional, and they would come back. Every child throws a tantrum. Every child eventually comes home. High Speaker Yeller said these words at the first council session. After humanity's departure, he stood on his platform of light, ancient and calm, and told the remaining 437 species that nothing had changed. The galaxy had existed for billions of years before humans learned to walk upright. It would continue without them. Counselor Dren was even more confident. He gave interviews to every major news network in the galaxy. He said the humans had proven his point by leaving. They were unstable, they were dramatic, they were not ready for the responsibilities of galactic civilization. The doctrine he had proposed was more necessary than ever. And when the humans crawled back, begging to rejoin, they would be made to accept it. In his private quarters, Dren poured himself a drink and smiled. Everything was going according to plan. The first sign that everything was not going according to plan came 32 days after the withdrawal. a medical station. On the border of Rithani space sent an emergency transmission to the council. The plague was back, not the original strain that had killed billions decades ago, a new mutation, faster and more aggressive, that attacked the nervous system instead of the blood. 3 colonies were already infected. The death toll was climbing by the hour. The council responded quickly. They sent their best doctors, their finest medical ships, their most advanced equipment. The Visari, who were the galaxy's masters of biology and medicine, took the lead. They had studied the original human cure for years. They understood its principles. They were confident they could adapt it to fight the new strain. They could not. The human cure had been built on something that the Visari could not fully explain. The humans had not simply analyzed the plague and designed a countermeasure. They had somehow understood the way the virus thought, the way it moved, the way it adapted. They had predicted its mutations before they happened and built defenses against versions of the plague that did not yet exist. It was not just science, it was something close to instinct, a kind of biological intuition that no species possessed. Without the humans running their quiet, continuous monitoring program, the new strain had appeared and spread before anyone noticed, and without human researchers to build a new cure, the Visari were left trying to reverse engineer brilliance they did not fully understand. Within 2 months, 11 million people were dead across 4 worlds. Second sign came 60 days after the withdrawal, and it was worse. Ships began disappearing, not in battle, not from piracy. They simply vanished during fold space jumps, arriving at coordinates that were wrong, sometimes by a little, sometimes by a lot. A cargo hauler carrying medical supplies jumped to what should have been an empty transit point and materialized inside asteroid field. All hands lost. A passenger liner carrying 3,000 travelers arrived 6 light years off course, stranded in deep space with failing life support. They were rescued barely. After 2 weeks, the fold space navigation grid was failing. Engineers from a dozen species rushed to examine the grid's beacon network. What they found confused them. The beacons were functioning perfectly. The hardware was fine. The software was fine. Everything was exactly as the humans had built it. But deep inside the grid's operating code, they found something they had never noticed before. Thousands of tiny adjustments, microcorrections made in real time, constantly, every hour of every day for 40 years. The grid was not a static system. Space itself shifted and changed, and the grid needed to shift with it. The humans had been making those adjustments by hand, quietly, without telling anyone, without asking for help, without ever once mentioning that the entire navigation system, the galaxy, depended on required constant human attention to function. No one else knew how to make those adjustments. The math involved was beyond anything the grid's original documentation described. The humans had improved the system so many times in so many small ways that it had become something only they understood. 3 major shipping lanes collapsed within 4 months. Trade slowed to a crawl. Worlds that depended on imports began to ration food and fuel. The third sign came 90 days after the withdrawal. The Dravosi and the Karn went to war. Their peace had lasted 30 years, brokered by human mediators who had spent months living with both species, learning their Languages, eating their food, sleeping. In their homes, the humans had not imposed a peace, they had built one. Brick by making both sides feel heard and respected, the council sent its own diplomats to stop the fighting. The authority sent their most experienced negotiator, a being who had settled disputes between stars. He arrived on the Dravasi home world with great ceremony and delivered a speech about unity and cooperation. The Dravosi told him to leave. They did not trust the authority. They had never trusted the authority. They had trusted the humans, and the humans were gone. Chelarn did not even let the council diplomat land. Within weeks, the border skirmishes turned into full battles. Cities burned, millions fled their homes, and the galaxy watched helpless. Because no one could do what the humans had done, no one could walk into the fire and make both sides listen. Fourth sign was the quietest and in many ways the most frightening. The universal translation matrix began to fail. It started small, a word here, a phrase there, the Sasari greeting translated with the wrong emotional tone, ahari. Trade offer rendered with a subtle implication of threat that was not in the original. Most people did not notice. Those who did assumed it was a minor software glitch. It was not minor. The translation matrix was the most complex piece of software ever created. It did not simply convert words from one language to another. It understood context, culture, emotion, intent, and 1,000 subtle things that made communication between alien species possible. And like everything else the humans had built, it required constant care. Languages evolved. New words were created. Old meanings shifted. Humans had been updating the matrix every single day, feeding it new data, correcting its errors, teaching it to understand the way living languages breathed and changed. Without those updates, the matrix began to drift. Slowly at first, then faster. A trade negotiation between the Valkyrie and the Orisi collapsed when the phrase "we agree to your terms" was translated as "we reject your offer and consider it an insult." Both sides left the table furious. It took weeks to discover what had happened, and by then the damage was done. A border incident between two minor species nearly erupted into war when a military communication reading "stand down and hold position" was translated as "prepare weapons and advance." Only luck and a bilingual officer on one of the ships prevented a massacre. The galaxy was losing the ability to talk to itself. Calvin watched all of this from his small office in the archives of Orion's cradle. He had stopped recording council sessions because the sessions had become nothing but screaming. Instead, he had begun a different project. He was going back through 60 years of records, tracing every human contribution to galactic civilization, no matter how small. What he found kept him awake at night. It was everywhere. Humans had been everywhere doing everything, and somehow nobody had noticed. They had redesigned waste processing systems on space stations that were not their own. They had improved water purification on colony worlds they had no claim to. They had sent teachers to planets that had never asked for help and had never said thank you. They had shared agricultural techniques, engineering solutions, medical knowledge, and 100 other things freely, openly, without contracts or conditions or demands for recognition. They had done it so quietly that most species did not even know it had happened. The improvements had simply appeared and everyone had assumed they were natural progress. Kivin compiled his findings into a report. It was 400 pages long, and every page made him feel smaller. He requested a special session of the council to present it. The hall was half empty when he spoke. Many species had stopped attending, but those who came listened in growing horror as Kelvin laid out the evidence. He showed them charts and data and records and testimony. He showed them the plague monitoring system, the navigation corrections, the translation updates, the diplomatic interventions, the infrastructure improvements, the educational programs, the agricultural aid, the scientific research shared. Without credit, he showed them that humanity had not been a minor member of the council. Humanity had been the foundation the council was built on, and no one had seen it because the humans had never asked to be seen. When he finished, the hall was silent. Not the angry silence of the day humanity left. A different kind of silence, the silence of people realizing they had made a terrible mistake. Then from the back of the hall someone asked the question that had been growing in the mind of every intelligence agency, every military commander, and every frightened politician in the galaxy. What are they building behind those closed borders? Because the humans had not just left. They had sealed their space completely. 14 star systems locked down. Communications dark, borders closed. Long-range scans showed massive energy signatures, enormous construction projects, activity on a scale that made no sense for a civilization of their size. The humans were building something, and no one in the galaxy knew what it was. Kelvin stood at the podium, surrounded by his 400 pages of evidence, and looked out at the frightened faces of the galaxy's leaders. He had no answer for them. He had only the growing terrible certainty that the galaxy had thrown away the best thing it ever had, and that whatever came next, they had brought it on themselves. He returned to his office that night and sat in the dark for a long time. Through his window, he could see the distant stars of human space, faint and unreachable. Somewhere behind those stars, the humans were doing something, and the galaxy, which had treated them like children, was beginning to understand that it had never really known them at all. The translation matrix glitched again as he sat there. His personal communicator displayed a message from a colleague in a language he could not read. The system that was supposed to bridge every gap between every species in the galaxy could not translate a simple greeting anymore. Calvin turned off the communicator and stared at the stars. The humans had not slammed the door when they left. They had simply stopped holding it open, and now the galaxy was learning slowly and painfully just how heavy that door really was. 18 months after humanity closed its borders, the galaxy learned something it had forgotten. There were monsters in the dark, and they had been waiting. The Ya Dominion had been quiet for 300 years. They were a predator species, cold and patient, with bodies built like armor and minds built for conquest. In the old days before the council, they had swallowed entire civilizations. They ate worlds the way fire eats wood, moving from one to the next, leaving nothing behind but ash and silence. The council had not stopped them. Treaties had not stopped them. What had stopped them was a small human research fleet parked near the edge of their territory studying a nebula. The fleet carried no weapons. It was filled with scientists, not soldiers. The Humans were genuinely interested in the nebula. They had published papers about it. They had invited other species to come study it with them, but the ZA did not know what the fleet carried. They could not scan it. Human ships had shielding technology that no one else could penetrate, and the Zeal had spent decades trying to figure out what was behind those shields. Every scenario they ran, every war game they played, came back with the same answer: unknown. And the Yale, for all their love of conquest, were not stupid. They did not attack things they did not understand. So they waited. For 300 years they waited, and then the human fleet left. The Zio moved within a week. Their first target was a small colony world called Tessara, home to a peaceful species of farmers and artists who had never fired a weapon in their entire history. The Yale fleet arrived in orbit, blocked all communications, and landed troops. The conquest took 4 hours. The Tesserans did not resist. They did not know how. The Council received the distress signal 3 days later, relayed through a smuggler who had escaped the blockade. By the time they organized a response, the Geel had already taken a second world, and they were not the only ones moving. The creed of the Hollow had existed in the shadows. For centuries, they were not a species, but a cult drawn from dozens of different races, united by a single belief that the universe was dying, that entropy was God, and that the faithful should help it along. They worshiped destruction the way others worshiped creation. Their greatest dream was to extinguish a star. For decades, they had been building networks, planting agents, stealing technology, and planning, and for decades human intelligence operatives had been quietly taking them apart. Not with armies or warships, with patient human agents, had infiltrated the creed at every level. They had identified leaders, disrupted supply chains, corrupted communications, and turned key members into informants. The creed never knew why their plans kept failing. They never knew that every time they built something, invisible hands were carefully breaking it. When the humans left, those invisible hands disappeared. The creed moved fast. Within months of the withdrawal, they carried out their first major attack. A series of bombs destroyed the power grid of an orbital station, killing 8,000 people. A month later, they sabotaged a terraforming facility, turning a developing colony world into a poisonous wasteland. And they were growing bolder, recruiting faster, building towards something much larger. And then there were the pirates. Before the withdrawal, human patrol ships had roamed the trade lanes. They were not the biggest ships or the most heavily armed, but they were crewed by humans, and humans had a reputation. They were unpredictable. They were creative. They did not follow standard tactical patterns. Fighting a human crew was like fighting someone who had read every book on warfare and then thrown them all away and made up something new. On the spot, pirates feared human patrols the way small animals fear hawks, not because the hawks were always present, but because they could appear at any moment from any direction, and you would never see them coming. Without those patrols, piracy exploded. Trade ships were seized, crews were killed or enslaved, cargo was stolen, insurance rates for interstellar shipping tripled, then tripled again. Smaller species that depended on trade for survival began to starve. The galaxy was burning, and the people who used to fight the fires were gone. The council, or what was left of It tore itself apart. 3 factions emerged from the wreckage. The first called themselves the Reconcilers. They were led by Calvin, who had gone from quiet historian to reluctant politician. In the space of a year, the Reconcilers wanted one simple thing: find the humans, apologize, and beg them to come back. They argued that pride had caused this disaster and that only humility could fix it. The second faction was led by Counselor Dren, who had somehow become more stubborn as everything fell apart around him. He called his group the Sovereignty Coalition, but everyone else called them the Supremacists. Dren argued that the galaxy's problems proved that relying on humans had been the mistake all along. The solution was not to bring them back, but to become strong enough to survive without them. He pushed for massive military buildup, forced conscription, and emergency powers for the Council. The third faction had no leader and no name. They were the species that simply gave up. One by one, they withdrew from the Council, sealed their borders, and tried to survive alone. They had watched the humans do it, and they thought it looked like the only sane choice. High Speaker Yelthari watched his life's work crumble. From his platform of light, he had led the Council for longer than most species had existed. He had believed truly and completely that the HFY was the right way, that age meant wisdom, that the oldest should guide the youngest, that order and hierarchy were the foundations of civilization. Now he sat alone in his chambers at night, reading Calvin's report for the 20th time, and he felt something he had not felt in 10,000 years: doubt. He began his own investigation using the HFY archives, the most complete historical record in the galaxy. He went back through 60 years of records, looking at every crisis, every disaster, every miss, every war that almost started and somehow did not. Every single one had human fingerprints on it, but here was the thing that broke him. The fingerprints were hidden, deliberately hidden. When the humans cured the plague, they had published the cure under a joint Thesari human research label, letting the Thesari take most of the credit. When they built the navigation grid, they had presented it as a council project, not a human one. When they brokered peace between the Dravosi and the Shalon, the final treaty was signed in a Dravosi temple, and the human mediators had quietly left before the ceremony so that the two species could celebrate their peace without an outsider in the room. The humans had not just helped, they had hidden their help. They had given the galaxy everything and then stepped back so that others could feel proud of what had been accomplished. Yelthari put down the records and stared at the wall of his chamber. He was 10,000 years old. He had seen empires rise and fall. He had watched stars be born and die. And in all that time, in all those centuries of watching lesser species struggle and fight and fail, he had never once imagined that the youngest species in the galaxy would be the most generous. He summoned Calvin to a private meeting. The young historian arrived, nervous and out of breath, still not used to being called before the most powerful being in the galaxy. Yelthari asked him one question: did they know? Did they know we would fall apart without them? Calvin thought about it carefully. He thought about the humans he had met over the years, the delegates and scientists and engineers and diplomats. He thought about the way they talked, the way they worked, the way they always seemed to be looking at the galaxy with a mixture of wonder and sadness, like parents watching children play near a cliff. I don't think they cared about that. Kelvin said, I think they just helped. Because they could. Yalthari closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they seemed dimmer than before. Outside the galaxy continued to burn. The Zale took a third world, then a fourth. The Creed of the Hollow attacked a fuel depot that supplied an entire sector. Pirates captured a council warship and turned it against the very trade lanes it was supposed to protect. And behind their closed borders, the humans were building long-range scans, the few that could penetrate even the edges of human space showed energy readings that made no sense. Massive structures in orbit around human worlds, power signatures that dwarfed anything the galaxy had ever recorded, fleet movements on a scale that suggested hundreds of new ships, maybe thousands. Every intelligence agency in the galaxy was asking the same question. Every military commander was losing sleep over it. Every politician whispered about it in dark rooms. What were the humans building, and what would happen when they were done? Khyven received his answer on a cold night, alone in his office, surrounded by the records of a civilization that was falling apart. His communicator buzzed with an incoming transmission on a frequency that should not have been active. It was an old channel, one that had been used by the human diplomatic corps before the withdrawal. It had been dead for 18 months. The message contained 2 words. No sender, no identification, no encryption, just 2 words sitting on his screen like a promise. Not yet. Calvin stared at those words for a long time. His hands were shaking. His heart was beating so hard he could feel it in his throat. Not yet, not never, not goodbye, not yet. He turned off his communicator, walked to his window and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there behind borders that no one could cross, the humans were waiting, and for the first time in 18 months, Khyven felt something other than fear. He felt hope. It was small and fragile and probably foolish, but it was there, burning in his chest like a tiny flame, and he held onto it with everything he had, because in a galaxy that was going mad, hope was the only thing left worth holding. 2 years after the humans left, the galaxy was at war with itself, and it was losing. The Zell Dominion had consumed 8 star systems. Their fleet moved through council space like a slow, unstoppable wave, taking everything in its path. The species they conquered were given 2 choices: serve or die. Most served. Those who refused were not killed quickly. The Creed of the Hollow had done the unthinkable. They had detonated a star, not a dead star, not an empty system, but a living sun with 3 inhabited worlds orbiting it, 2 billion people gone in a flash of light that was visible across half the galaxy. The Creed called it a holy sacrifice. They promised it was only the beginning. The Dravosi-Chalan War had turned into something darker than war. It had become extermination. Both sides had stopped taking prisoners. Cities were not captured but erased. The death toll had passed 1 billion and was climbing. The council was finished. Its hall on Orion's cradle was dark and empty. The platforms that had once held 438 species now gathered dust. The lights that had burned for millennia had been turned off to save power. The great experiment of galactic cooperation was over, and it had ended not with a bang, but with silence. High Speaker Yelri sat alone in his chambers. He had not eaten in days. He had not spoken to anyone in weeks. His glow, the blue light that marked him, A3 Elder, had faded to almost nothing. He was dying, not from any disease, but from something worse. He was dying from the knowledge that he had helped destroy. Everything he had spent 10,000 years building. He activated his recording device. He did not address the council. Because there was no council, he did not address the authority, because they had retreated to their home world and sealed it behind walls of silence. He addressed humanity. His voice was thin and broken, nothing like the commanding tone that had once filled the great hall. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with the care of a man who knew these might be his last. We were wrong, he said. We were afraid of you, and our fear made us cruel. You owed us nothing, and you gave us everything, and we repaid you with contempt. I do not ask you to save us. We do not deserve saving. I ask you to save the billions of innocents who had no part in our arrogance, the children on the worlds the gale have taken, families the creed has murdered, the people who never voted against you, who never spoke against you, who never even knew what was being done in their name. He paused, his breath rattled in his chest. If there is anything left of the bond we once shared, if you can hear this, if you still care, please. He transmitted the message on every frequency, in every language, openly, without encryption, for the entire galaxy to hear. He wanted everyone to know. He wanted every species to hear. The oldest being in the galaxy begged the youngest for help. Then he turned off the device and waited. 1 day passed, nothing. 2 days, silence. 3 days, the galaxy held its breath and heard nothing but the sound of its own destruction. On the morning of the 4th day, the borders of human space opened. Calvin was the first to see it. He had been living on a refugee station near the edge of human territory, helping displaced families, documenting the collapse, doing what little he could. In a galaxy that was falling apart, his long-range sensors had been pointed at the human border for months, watching, waiting, hoping. When the energy reading spiked, he thought it was a malfunction. He checked the instruments 3 times. He ran diagnostics. He recalibrated. The readings were real. The border was opening, not a crack, not a gap. The entire boundary of human space, all 14 systems, opened at once, like a curtain being pulled back, and what came through was nothing the galaxy had ever seen. The human fleet that emerged was not the modest collection of research vessels and light frigates that the galaxy remembered. This was something new, something built with purpose and power and a kind of fierce, protective love that the galaxy had no word for. There were warships, yes, hundreds of them, sleek and fast and bristling with technology that no scanner could identify, but they were not the heart of the fleet. The heart was something else entirely. Shield carriers, massive vessels, each one the size of a small moon, designed for one purpose: to project defensive barriers around entire planets. They could wrap a world in a shell of energy so strong that nothing could get through, not missiles, not fleets, not even the radiation from a dying star. They were not weapons of war, they were weapons of protection. Behind them came the medical ships, floating hospitals, enormous and white, filled with doctors and medicine and equipment that could treat any disease, heal any wound, cure any plague. Each one carried enough supplies to save a world. And behind them came the engineering vessels, ships that carried factories inside them that could land on a shattered world and rebuild. Its infrastructure in days, power, plants, water systems, food production, housing, everything a civilization needed to survive, packed into hulls of steel and carried across the stars. Fleet split into 3 groups as it crossed the border. The first group, which the humans called Task Force Aurora, turned toward Zale space. They moved fast, faster than any fleet that size should have been able to move, and they hit the X-War machine like a thunderstorm, but they did not fight the way the galaxy expected. They did not destroy. In the first battle at the occupied world of Tessera, the human warships surrounded the Zale fleet and fired weapons that did not kill. They fired pulses that shut down engines, disabled weapons, and cut power to shields. The ZA ships went dark one by one, like candles being blown out. Then the humans sent boarding teams, not Marines with guns, engineers with tools. They boarded the disabled ships, secured the crews, and took them prisoner. Every single jail soldier was captured alive. Every single one was given food, medical attention, and a clean place to sleep. The jail commander, a warrior who had conquered 8 worlds, stood in a human holding cell and demanded to know why he was still breathing. The human officer who answered him was a young woman with tired eyes and a calm voice. "Because killing you would be easy," she said. "And we don't do things because they're easy." Task Force Aurora liberated every occupied world in 3 weeks. Not one Yale prisoner was harmed, not one conquered civilian was forgotten. The humans landed on each world with food and medicine before they landed with soldiers. They treated the wounded, rebuilt what was broken, and stayed until the people were safe. The second group, Task Force Meridian, went after the Creed of the Hollow. This was different. This was harder. The Creed was not an army but a shadow spread across 100 worlds, hidden in the gaps between civilizations. But the humans, it turned out, had never stopped watching, even behind their closed borders. Even during 2 years of silence, their intelligence network had continued to operate. They knew every Creed cell, every leader, every hidden base, every stolen weapon. They had mapped the entire organization with a patience and precision that was almost frightening. The strikes were surgical, fast, clean, and targeted. Creed leaders were captured in their beds. Weapon caches were seized before they could be used. The network that had destroyed a star was taken apart in 72 hours, piece by piece, without a single civilian casualty. The Creed's followers, the thousands of ordinary people who had been recruited through desperation and despair, were not punished. They were offered help, counseling, education, homes, jobs. The humans understood something that the council never had: that most people who join cults are not evil. They are lost, and lost people need a hand to hold, not a cell to rot in. The third group, Task Force Solace, went everywhere else: every refugee camp, every famine world, every plague zone, every place where people were suffering and no one was coming to help. They came to help. Kylan watched it happen from aboard a human flagship. Aravos had sent him a personal invitation transmitted on the old diplomatic frequency, asking him to come and see, to witness, to record. He had accepted immediately, and now he stood on the bridge of a ship called the Times Meridian Star Asterisk, watching the liberation of Tessera through the viewport. Human Marines were landing on the surface, They came out of their drop ships not with weapons raised, but with their hands open, carrying medical kits and food rations and blankets. The Terrans, the gentle farmers and artists, who had been conquered and brutalized by the Yaw for months, came out of their hiding places and stared. Then they fell to their knees. Calvin watched a Tesseran child, no more than 6 years old, walk up to a human soldier. The soldier was twice her size, covered in armor, carrying enough equipment to build a field hospital. The child reached up and touched his hand. Soldier knelt down, took off his helmet, and smiled at her. Khyven had to turn away. His eyes were burning, and the sorry were not supposed to cry. He found Aller Voss standing at the back of the bridge, watching the same scene on a monitor. She looked older than she had 2 years ago. Thinner, there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of months of planning and work and sleepless nights. He walked up to her and asked the question that had been burning in his chest since the day she walked out of the council hall. Why, after everything we did to you, after the contempt and the insults and the doctrine and the silence, after we drove you away and then let the galaxy burn because we were too proud to ask for help, why did you come back? Aura looked at him. Her eyes were red, and he realized she had been crying too. Not from sadness, from something else, something he could not name. We didn't leave because we stopped caring, she said. We left because you wouldn't let us care. Every time we tried to help, we were told to sit down. Every time we solved a problem, we were told we were overstepping. Every time we reached out, someone slapped our hand away. We didn't leave because we wanted to. We left because staying was killing us. She looked back at the screen, at the Tesseran child holding the human soldier's hand. And when we heard people were dying, when we heard children were scared and families were broken and worlds were burning, we couldn't stay away. We built those ships in 2 years. Kelvin, 2 years of every human and 14 systems working every day, giving everything they had, building something that could protect the people who had thrown us out, not because we owed them, not because we wanted something in return, because that's who we are. That's all we've ever been. Her voice broke on the last word, and she turned away. Calvin stood there for a long time, watching the liberation of a world through the eyes of the species that had been rejected by every soul on it, and he understood finally completely what made humans different. It was not their technology, it was not their intelligence, it was not their creativity or their stubbornness or their strange, fierce energy. It was this impossible, irrational, beautiful refusal to stop caring about people who had never cared about them. Back on Orion's cradle, High Speaker Yelthari stood at the observation deck and watched the human fleet pass overhead. He was frail now, barely able to stand, leaning on a staff that his ancestors had carried for 100 generations. The fleet moved above him like a river of light, ship after ship after ship, each one carrying salvation to a galaxy that had done nothing to earn it. Old Authority watched them go, and for the first time in 10,000 years he wept. Not from sadness, not from relief, from shame, deep, burning, unforgivable shame. Because he had looked down on these people from his platform of light and called them children. He had let them be silenced and insulted and pushed to the bottom of the hall, and now those children were saving his galaxy. The tears ran down his ancient face and fell like rain onto the cold floor of the observation deck. Above him the human ships flew on, carrying hope to every corner of a broken universe, and they asked for nothing in return. 6 months after the humans came back, the guns fell silent across the galaxy. The jail Dominion was finished, not destroyed, not exterminated, but finished as a conquering power. Their entire military leadership sat in clean, well-lit cells on a human station awaiting trial, not a trial run by the species they had conquered, not a trial run by the council that had failed to stop them. Fair trial with evidence and lawyers and judges drawn from neutral species, organized by humans who insisted that even monsters deserve justice. The Geo did not understand this. Their culture was built on strength. The strong took, the weak suffered. That was the natural order. They had been defeated and they expected to die when the humans fed them instead, when they gave them medical care and clean clothes and allowed them to speak in their own defense. The Yale did not know what to do with it. Something began to change inside their culture. It started with the younger soldiers, the ones who had been captured on Tessara and treated with kindness by the people they had conquered. They returned home with questions that their elders could not answer. If strength was everything, why were the humans the strongest force in the galaxy, choosing mercy? If the weak deserved to suffer, why had the humans suffered under the Council's contempt for 60 years and come back with open hands? The question spread. They moved through Ja society like water through cracks in stone, slow and quiet and impossible to stop. Within a year, the first Zell cultural exchange program with humans would begin. Within 5 years, the Zeal would become one of humanity's strongest allies. But that was the future. For now, the questions were enough. The creed of the Hollow was gone. Its leaders were in custody. Its networks were dismantled. Its weapons were destroyed. And its followers, the thousands of lost and desperate people who had turned to destruction because they could find nothing else to believe in, were being given something new to believe in. Human counselors worked with them one by one, patient and kind, helping them find their way back from the edge of the void. It was slow work. It was hard work. Most of the galaxy thought it was a waste of time. The humans did it anyway. The Dravosi Shalarn War ended not with a treaty, but with exhaustion. Both sides had fought themselves to the bone, and when human mediators arrived, they found two civilizations too tired to refuse peace. The mediators did what they had done 30 years before. They sat with both sides. They listened, they ate their food and learned their songs and slept in their homes. They did not judge, they did not take sides, they simply made both species feel heard, and slowly, carefully, painfully, they rebuilt the bridge that hatred had burned. It would take years to heal. Both sides knew this, but the killing stopped in 4. Now that was enough. Across the galaxy, Task Force Solace continued its work. Plague worlds received cures developed during humanity's 2 years of isolation. Cures so advanced they could adapt to new mutations in real time, the way human doctors had always worked, but now encoded in technology that anyone could use. Famine worlds received not just food, but the tools and knowledge to feed themselves forever. Shattered infrastructure was rebuilt stronger and better than before. The humans did not just fix what was broken, they taught Others how to fix it themselves. They shared everything, every technique, every technology, every piece of knowledge freely and openly, the way they always had. They set up training programs and schools and research partnerships. They answered every question, no matter how basic. They never made anyone feel stupid for not knowing, and slowly, carefully, the galaxy began to breathe again. Counselor Drin was put on trial, not by the humans. The humans had nothing to do with it. His own people, the Valkyrie, turned on him. They had watched their trade routes collapse, their allies vanish, their economy crumble, all because Dren had been afraid of a species that wanted nothing more than to help. The trial was short. The evidence was overwhelming. Dren was stripped of his rank, his titles, his property, and his name. He was exiled to a barren moon on the edge of Valkyrie space, alone with nothing but a writing terminal. And the rest of his life he spent that life writing. The book he produced was called The Silence We Created, and it was the most honest thing any politician in the galaxy had ever written. He did not make excuses. He did not blame others. He wrote about fear, about how it grows in the dark spaces between species, how it turns suspicion into policy and policy into cruelty. He wrote about how he had looked at humans and seen a threat when he should have seen a friend. The book became required reading on a 100 worlds. Dren never knew this. He died alone on his moon, but his words lived on, a warning to every generation that came after. Kelvin published his own work. He called it The Invisible Architects, Humanity's Unsung Legacy in the Galactic Age. It was everything he had gathered, every record, every piece of evidence, every hidden contribution, every quiet act of kindness that humanity had performed in 60 years of being treated like dirt. The book was read by billions. For most species, it was the first time they understood the full scope of what had happened, the first time they saw the complete picture. Young species, barely a century into space flight, had walked into a galaxy of ancient civilizations and quietly, without asking for credit or thanks, had made everything better, and the galaxy had responded by trying to put them in a cage. The shame that followed was enormous. It moved through the galaxy like a wave, touching every species, every world, every individual who had ever thought of humans as lesser. Some responded with anger at themselves, some responded with grief, some responded with determination to be better. All of them responded with a single shared understanding: this could never happen again. The question of what came next was answered by Voss. She was offered the position of High Speaker of a new galactic government. The offer was made formally, publicly, by a coalition of 300 species. They wanted her to lead them. They wanted a human to lead them. After everything that had happened, they trusted no one else. Ella declined. She stood before the assembly, the same assembly that had refused to let her speak 2.5 years ago, and she said no, not because she was angry, not because she wanted to punish them, because leading them was not the point. It had never been the point. We didn't come back to be your leaders, she said. We came back to be your partners. We don't want to be above you. We want to walk beside you. That's all we've ever wanted. Instead of a new council with a new High Speaker, humanity proposed something different. They called it the Compact of Equals, not a hierarchy, not a system where older species sat above Younger ones a partnership, a true partnership where every species had an equal voice, equal rights, and equal responsibilities, where no one was junior and no one was senior, where decisions were made together by consensus, with every voice heard. The Compact's founding charter was written by a committee of representatives from every willing species, but one clause was written by Elora personally. She called it the Doctrine of Remembrance, and it was simple: let no species be forgotten, let no contribution go unacknowledged, let no voice be silenced by the arrogance of those who came before. The charter was signed in a ceremony that lasted 3 days. Every species that came forward signed it in their own way, in their own language, with their own traditions. The Sari sang as they signed, the Dravosi pressed their fists to their hearts. Chelin wept openly. Even the Yale sent a representative, a young soldier who had been captured on Tessara, who signed with shaking hands and then bowed to the human delegation. The ether were last. High Speaker Yelthari, frail and fading, walked to the signing table on legs that barely held him. He had resigned position. He was no longer High Speaker of anything. He was just an old man at the end of a long life, trying to do one last thing right. He signed the charter in the ancient Yari script, the same script his people had used when they first traveled between stars 10,000 years ago. When he finished, he sat down the pen and looked at it for a long time. Then he looked up at Ara, who stood across the table from him, watching with quiet eyes. Where will the new assembly meet? He asked. Ara smiled. It was the first real smile anyone had seen from her in years. We have a place, she said. The new assembly hall was not on a space station. It was not on any existing world. It was on a planet that had not existed 3 years ago. During their 2 years behind closed borders, while the galaxy burned and broke, the humans had been doing more than building ships. They had been growing a world, a garden planet, green and blue and alive, with forests and rivers and oceans and skies full of birds that the humans had brought from Earth. They had terraformed it from a barren rock into a paradise, using technology they had developed in secret, working day and night, building something beautiful in the middle of all that darkness. They had planned it as a gift, not as a bargaining chip, not as a condition of their return, a gift freely given, regardless of whether the galaxy ever asked them to come back. If the galaxy had never called, if Yelthari had never sent his message, the humans would have finished the planet anyway and offered it to whoever needed a home. That was who they were. The inauguration ceremony was held on the planet's surface, in a valley surrounded by young trees, under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Thousands of delegates from hundreds of species gathered on the soft grass and looked up at the building that would be their new home. It was not a tower of power. It was a circle of glass and stone, open to the air, with no platform higher than any other. Yelthari attended as an honorary advisor, a title Lara had created specifically for him. He moved through the crowd slowly, leaning on his staff, and everywhere he went, people stepped aside and bowed, not because he was powerful, because he was the one who had found the courage to beg. Near the end of the ceremony, as the sun set over the new world and the sky turned gold, Yelthari found standing alone at the edge of the valley, looking out over the forest. He approached her, and then he did something that no author had ever done in recorded history. He bowed deeply, fully the way the authority bowed only to their own gods. I spent 10,000 years believing age was wisdom. He said, his voice barely a whisper. You taught me that wisdom is kindness. Ara looked at him for a long moment, then she reached out and took his hand. Gently, the way one holds something precious and fragile. We didn't teach you anything, High Speaker, she said. We just reminded you of something you already knew. Yelthari held her hand and closed his eyes. The last light of the sun touched his face, and for a moment, just a moment, his glow returned, blue and bright, the way it had been before. The world fell apart in the crowd. Calvin stood with his recording device in his hands, capturing everything: the ceremony, the speeches, the signing, the sunset, the old Yori bowing to the young human. He recorded it all with steady hands and burning eyes. That night, back in his quarters on the New World, he opened his journal and wrote his final entry. He wrote slowly, carefully, the way he had been taught, because a historian's words were meant to last. I have studied 1,000 species across 10,000 years of history. I have read the records of empires that stretched across galaxies and civilizations that burned brighter than stars. I have seen courage and cruelty and everything in between. But I have never seen anything like humanity. They were mocked and they helped. They were ignored and they gave. They were cast out and they came back. Not with anger, not with vengeance, with food and medicine and open hands and a planet they had grown in the dark, just in case someone needed a home. They could have conquered us. They had the power. They could have ruled us. They had the right. They could have abandoned us forever, and every species in this galaxy would have deserved it. Instead, they came back with open hands and asked us to walk beside them. I do not know what the future holds. I do not know if we deserve what they have given us, but I know this: the universe has never seen anything like humanity, and I pray it never forgets. He closed the journal and set it on the table. Through his window, the stars were bright above the New World, and somewhere in the distance he could hear music, human music, strange and beautiful, drifting across the valley on the warm night air. Calvin listened for a long time, then he turned off the light and let the music carry him to sleep on a world that had been built by kindness under stars that had learned to shine a little brighter. The galaxy had gone mad when the humans left. It found its sanity when they came back, and in the end that was the only story that mattered, not a story of power or conquest or revenge. A story of people who were told they did not belong, and who came back anyway because someone somewhere needed help, and humans could never walk away from